Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History, and today I'm going to be talking about East Africans and Horn of Africans. So, a part of me did want to separate these two areas because while the Horn of Africa is in East Africa, there are a lot of differences from the Horn of Africa regarding East Africa. But at the same time, I just decided to just keep it together. So, anyways, the Horn of Africa and East Africa are often grouped together geographically, but anthropologically they are among the most diverse regions on Earth. They sit at a crossroads between Africa, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean world, and historically even South Asia. As a result, the region is difficult to fit nearly into modern racial categories. So the Horn of Africa generally refers to Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti. Sometimes parts of Sudan and South Sudan are included in broader discussions. The larger East African region generally includes the countries that mentioned, but also Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Mozambique sometimes, and Madagascar. So, when it comes to the geographic significance, it is one of humanity's most important regions. The region contains the Ethiopian highlands, the southern Red Sea, the Gulf Aden, the eastern edge of the Sahara's influence, and part of the Great Rift Valley. It's one of the main routes throughout which humanity dispersed outside of Africa roughly 60,000 to 80,000 years ago. So, when it comes to the anthropological history, East Africa is often considered the deepest reservoir of human genetic diversity. Some of the oldest known human fossils come from Omo Valley, Hadar, and Olduvai Gorge. The region has experienced multiple overlapping migrations. So, there's the indigenous African populations that have always been there pretty much the Afro-Asiatic expansion. So these are the ancestors of modern Somali, Afar, Oromo, Amhara, and Tigrayans. The Nilotic expansions, which are the ancestors of Dinka, Nuer, Luo, Maasai, and the Bantu expansions as ancestors of the much of modern Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Southern Africa are here. Then there's the Indian Ocean trade. So for over 2,000 years, there were contacts with Arabia, India, and Persia, especially amongst the Swahili coast. So there are different ethno-linguistic families. So the Afro-Asiatic includes Somali, Oromo, Afar, Amharic, Tigrinya. The Nilo-Saharan, which is the traditional classification, includes many Nilotic peoples like the Maasai, the Dinka, the Nuer, the Luo. The Niger-Congo, i.e. the Bantu, includes the Kikuyu, the Chaga, the Sukuma, and the Ganda. The Horn of Africa is distinct from the rest of East Africa and occupies a unique position within Africa. So the groups like the Somali, the Afar, the Amhara, the Tigrayans, and the Oromo show a combination of ancient African ancestry, ancient Northeast African ancestry, and ancient West Eurasian related ancestry entering thousands of years ago. This doesn't mean that they're mixed in the recent colonial sense. These ancestries became part of the local population several thousand years ago and are now indigenous to the region. Okay, so the simplest way to think about the region, anthropologically, East Africa is best used not as a single race, but as a continuum of African population shaped by some of the world's oldest human lineages on Earth, combined with millennia of interactions within the Middle East and the Indian Ocean world. The Horn of Africa in particular occupies a distinctive position. It is fully African, yet historically connected to Arabia and the Red Sea world in ways that make it one of the most unique population regions anywhere in the world. So now I'm going to talk about why they and their descendants are generally grouped together. So the main reason, or the first reason, is obviously geography. It's very simple. So the modern grouping is primarily geographic. Countries such as Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania occupy the eastern side of the African continent. So governments, international organizations, and academics often place them within a broad East Africa region and label. It's similar to how vastly different countries are grouped as quote unquote Western European or quote unquote Latin American. The second reason is shared deep human origins. East Africa and the Horn contain some of the oldest continuously inhabited regions on Earth. Many modern populations in the region descend from ancient Northeast African populations that have been interacting for thousands of years. Even though a Somali, Maasai, Oromo, and Kikuyu may be quite distinct culturally, their populations have often been connected through trade, migration, pastoralism, intermarriage, political empires over long periods. Anthropologists therefore often study them as part of the larger East African historical system. The third reason is colonial and modern state boundaries. So much of the modern grouping comes from the colonial era mapping. European powers divided Africa into territories and region, and over time, organizations such as African Union and United Nations began using regional categories like North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. These categories became institutionalized. The fourth reason is the quote unquote black African category abroad. So, in Western countries, mainly like Canada, the United States, or the United Kingdom, people from East Africa are often grouped together because of broader racial frameworks. For example, a Somali, an Ethiopian, a Kenyan, and a Tanzanian might all be categorized as quote unquote black or quote unquote African. This can obscure major differences that are obvious within Africa itself. Though within East Africa, these distinctions are enough that causes them to be seen separately in their countries or communities. But within the broader West, these differences are essentially minimized. The fifth reason is diaspora communities. So outside of Africa, East Africans are often grouped together because they face similar experiences regarding their immigration patterns, refugee histories, religious minority status, and shared African identity abroad. So in cities like Toronto, London, and Minneapolis, you frequently see East African community organizations serving multiple ethnic groups. So why their descendants are grouped together? The descendants of East Africans often are grouped together because racial systems tend to simplify ancestry. So for an example, someone whose grandparents were Somali, Ethiopian, and Eritrean may simply be categorized as Black or African in Canada or the United States. Over generations, descendants may develop identities such as Black Canadian, African Canadian, East African Canadian, alongside specific identities. This is similar to how descendants of Italians, Irish, Poles, and Greeks may all eventually be grouped as white in North America, despite history being seen as distinct groups, or historically being seen as distinct groups. Okay, so with the Horn of Africans, they specifically are grouped together because its people share several features. So the Afro-Asiatic languages are mainly spoken there, so many speak related languages such as Somali, Oromo, Amharic, Tigrinya, and Afar, where many communities historically relied on pastoralism, highland agriculture, Red Sea trade networks, and the long historical connections has shared historical spheres, including the Kingdom of Aksum and the Sultanate, as well as interactions across the Red Sea with the Arabian Peninsula. So, from a racial perspective, Horn of Africans occupy an interesting position. In Western societies, they are grouped into the broad Black/African category. Anthropologically, however, populations of the Horn form a distinctive Northeast African cluster with their own long regional history. This means two things can be true simultaneously. They are part of the broader African and Black diasporic experience in many countries. They also possess regional histories and ancestry that distinguish them from the West, Central, or Southern African populations. That tension between broad racial categories and more specific ethnic regional identities is one of the defining features of how East Africans and their descendants are understood today. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about the timeline of East Africa. So, prehistory. So, this is from 7 million to 300,000 years ago. So, from 7 to 4 million years ago, this is in regards to early human ancestors. So, some of humanity's earliest known ancestors live in what is now Ethiopia, Kenya, and Chad. Fossils such as Ardipithecus ramidus and Australopithecus afarensis come from this region. So from 300,000 to 70,000 BCE are the emergence of modern humans. The earliest known Homo sapiens appear in East Africa, so the important sites include Omo, Kibish, and Hirto. By roughly 70,000 years ago, some populations crossed into Arabia through the southern Red Sea corridor. The ancestors of nearly all non-Africans ultimately trace part of their ancestry back to East African populations. The Late Stone Age, which refers to 70,000 to 10,000 BCE, so humans spread throughout the Horn, the Rift Valley, and the East African coast. Populations were hunter-gatherers with increasing regional specialization. Some of today's deepest population lineages in Africa were already diverging. So now we're in the Neolithic and Pastoral era. So this is from 10,000 to 3000 BCE. So here's where the climate change just really starts to happen. The Sahara was greener than what it is today. People moved between Northeast Africa, the Nile Valley, and the Horn. Pastoralism, so cattle, sheep, and goats, spread throughout the region. The foundation of many later Cushitic-speaking populations emerged during this era. Now we're on to the early civilization. So this is from 3000 to 500 BCE. So the rise of Afro-Asiatic populations. So ancestors of many modern groups expanded, i.e. the Somali, the Afar, the Oromo, the Amhara, and the Tigrayans. The Horn became increasingly connected to Egypt and Arabia through the Red Sea trade. Now we have the Kingdom of Punt, which is from 2500 to 1000 BCE. So ancient Egyptians traded with a mysterious land called Land of Punt. Many scholars place Punt somewhere around the modern Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, or coastal Ethiopia, so essentially the Horn of Africa. Punt exported gold, incense, ivory, and exotic animals. This is one of the earliest documented Horn African civilizations. Now we're looking into the Classic era. So this is from 500 BCE to 700 CE. So the Kingdom of Dumt, one of the earliest states in northern Hun, emerged in what's now Ethiopia and Eritrea. Kingdom of Aksum. So this is from 100 BCE to 940 CE. This is one of Africa's greatest ancient civilizations. So the Kingdom of Aksum controlled the Red Sea trade, minted its own coins, maintained relations with the Roman world, and became one of the first major Christian states. Around the 4th century, Christianity became established under Izana of Aksum. So now we have the Islamic era. So this is from 600 to 1500. So the arrival of the Islam. So the first followers of Muhammad sought refuge in Aksum during the earliest years of Islam. Islam spread rapidly along Somali coast, or the Somali coast, the Eritrean coast, and the Swahili coast. So the rise of Somali Sultanates. Important states emerged like the Adal Sultanate, Ajuan Sultanate, and Ifat Sultanate. Somali merchants became major players in the Indian Ocean trade. Interesting, I did not know that. The Swahili civilization, so this is from 1000 to 1500. Along the East African coast, city-states flourished like the Kilwa, Kishiwani, the Lamu, the Zanzibar. These cities linked Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. So now we're in the early modern era. So this is from 1500 to 1800. So the Oromo expansion is one of the most important demographic events in Horn history. Ancestors of modern Oromo populations expanded across much of Ethiopia and surrounding areas. Today, the Oromo are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. So, Portuguese and Ottoman involvement. So, the Horn became part of the wider competition between Portugal and the Ottoman Empire. This altered trade routes and regional politics. The colonial era. So, this is from 1800 to 1960. So, the scramble for Africa. Much of East Africa came under European rule. Kenya was owned by the British, Uganda was ruled by the British, Tanzania was ruled by the German, then British, Eritrea was ruled by the Italians, and Somalia was ruled by the British and Italians. So Ethiopia is the sole exception of this, where a major turning point, which was the Battle of Adwa. Ethiopia defeated Italy and largely maintained independence. This became a symbol of African resistance to colonialism throughout the Black world. So now we're in 1960 to 1990. So decolonization. Most of the East African states gained independence during this period. New national identities formed around colonial borders. Pan-African influence. So Ethiopia became part especially and particularly important because of the Organization of the African Unity was headquartered in Addis Ababa. The Cold War. So the Horn became a major Cold War battleground. Conflicts included the Ethiopian Revolution, the Somali-Ethiopian Wars, and Eritrean independence struggle. Now we're in the modern era, so this is from 1990 to the present. New states and political change. So Eritrea became independent in 1993, South Sudan became independent in 2011. And now we have to talk about the global diaspora. So large East African communities now exist in Western places like Toronto in Canada, London in the United Kingdom, Minneapolis in the United States, and Stockholm in Sweden. This has created a new East African identity and many new East African identities abroad. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the average phenotype of the East African. And obviously, like I've done with all the other videos, I'm going to state this. There is no single East African phenotype in the way that some people would imagine. The region contains some of the greatest human diversity on Earth, and we're going to acknowledge that. Despite all that, there are some broad emphasis on broad regional patterns. So, the Horn of African phenotype. So, the Horn, which is in reference to Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti, is often recognized as having a distinctive Northeast African appearance. So, common traits that occur at a relatively high frequency or high frequencies include dark brown to very dark brown skin, narrow to medium facial features, often narrower noses than the African continental average, curly, quilled, or tightly curled hair, medium to tall stature, and lean body build. Many Horn populations show what anthropologists call a Northeast African climb, reflecting thousands of years of local evolution and ancient population exchanges around the Red Sea. Groups commonly associated with this phenotype include Somali, Afar, Amhara, Tigrayans, and many Oromo populations. However, there's still substantial variation within this so-called phenotype. So now I'm moving on to the Nilotic East African phenotype. So many Nilotic peoples have one of the most distinctive phenotypes in the world. So examples include the Dinka, the Nuer, the Maasai, and the Luo. So traits of this average phenotype often include very dark skin, exceptional height, so they're very, very tall, long limbs, lean physiques, narrow faces, and tightly coiled hair. So the Dinka are amongst the tallest people on Earth. These body proportions are often discussed in relation to adaptation to the hot climates. And now I am looking at the Bantu East African phenotype. So many East Africans belong to Bantu speaking populations. So examples of this include the Kikuyu, the Kamba, the Chaga, the Sukma, and the Ganda peoples. Traits like this typically include dark brown skin, medium to tall stature, wide variation in facial features, and tightly curled hair. These populations often resemble neighboring Central and Southern African Bantu groups while retaining regional distinctions that are specific or more specific to East Africa. So, if there was an average East African phenotype, and if we were to talk about the region overall, the average would be dark brown skin, curly to tightly coiled hair, medium to tall stature, lean build, facial features ranging from intermediate between the typical West African and Northeast African patterns. Why do East Africans often look distinct? So, anthropologists have long noted that East Africans are often visually distinguishable from many West and Central African populations. The reasons include the ancient population structure. So, essentially, East Africa has hosted diverse populations for tens of thousands of years. Another reason is the environmental adaptation. So, the climate, altitude, and ecology shaped body proportions that is different in East Africa compared to these other areas. Another reason is the long distance context. So, interactions with Northeast Africa, the Red Sea region, and the Indian Ocean world has them have distinct interactions and features and contexts compared to those other regions. And the fourth is internal diversity. So, Cushitic Nilotic, Bantu, Omotic, and other populations developed different physical tendencies over the millennia. Okay, so now I want to talk about East Africans and their relationships with race. So, this is kind of interesting because the modern concept of race was largely developed in Europe and the Americas, where East Africans really weren't a part of those areas. And it's not like they had the input of East Africans when it comes to how they saw race. Generally, East African societies historically organized themselves around very different categories that was not about race. So essentially, before colonialism, ethnicity mattered more than race, where most East and Horn Africans didn't divide people into broad racial categories such as black, white, or Asian. Instead, identity was often based on ethnicity, language, clan, religion, kingdom, or polity, and region. So, pretty much, a medieval Somali merchant was unlikely to think of himself as part of a single black race encompassing all Africans. He would more likely identify as Somali, Muslim, clan affiliated, and connected to the Indian Ocean world. Similarly, an Amhara noble in the era of the Kingdom of Aksum or later Ethiopian states would not have operated with modern American racial categories. So we then have to consider the colonial encounter. So things changed when Europeans increasingly categorized humanity into races. Beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars attempted to classify East Africans into racial hierarchies. Horn Africans became primarily controversial within these systems. Many Europeans noticed that some populations in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia often looked different from the stereotypes Europeans had developed about sub Saharan Africans. As a result, they invented theories such as the so called Hamitic hypothesis. This theory falsely claimed that advanced East African civilizations were created by migrants from outside Africa rather than by Africans themselves. Today, that theory is completely rejected by historians, archaeologists, and geneticists. So, East Africans and Blackness. Modern racial systems often place East Africans within a broad black categories. In countries such as Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, most East Africans are socially perceived as black. This includes Somalis, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Kenyans, Ugandans, and Tanzanians. However, the way East Africans relate to blackness varies considerably. So, what about the Horn's unique position in this? So, Horn of Africans often occupy an unusual place within racial discussions. Historically, outsiders have sometimes tried to place them between Africans and Middle Easterners. Modern genetics does not support the idea that Horn Africans are somehow non African or less African than other African populations. Rather, they are indigenous African populations whose ancestors have participated in Red Sea interactions for thousands of years. This creates a situation where, in Western societies, Horn Africans are usually racialized as black. In their own societies, ethnicity and nationality often remain more important than race. Some individuals strongly embrace the black identity, while others emphasize Somali, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Oromo, Amhara, or other identities first. East Africa and Pan Africanism. So the 20th century strengthened broader African racial identities. Ethiopia became increasingly important because it largely resisted colonization and defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa. For many people in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas, Ethiopia became a symbol of African sovereignty. Figures such as Marcus Garvey and later Pan African movements often reference Ethiopia as a symbol of black pride and independence. This helped integrate East Africans more firmly into global black identity, or that global black identity. Diaspora experiences. So, for East Africans living abroad, race often becomes more important than it was in their ancestral societies. A Somali Canadian, an Ethiopian American, or a Kenyan Briton may find themselves grouped with other black populations because that is how the surrounding society categorizes them. This creates multiple overlapping identities such as black, African, East African, national, i.e., Somali, Ethiopian, Kenyan, etc., ethnic, i.e., Oromo, Amhara, Kikuyu, Luo, etc. All may operate simultaneously. So, from a modern anthropological perspective, East Africans are indigenous African populations. Horn Africans are indigenous African populations. There's no scientific basis for treating them as a separate race from other Africans. They do, however, form distinctive regional population clusters with their own histories and physical tendencies. The old racial labels, i.e., Negroid, Caucasoid, Hamitic, are no longer considered scientifically valid descriptions of human biological variation. The central tension. So the key tension is this. Within East Africa and the Horn, people have traditionally thought in terms of ethnicity, language, clan, religion, and region. Outside of Africa, they are often incorporated into broader racial categories such as Black or Africans. Okay, so that concludes my video on East Africans and Horn of Africans. Now that I have completed it, I am glad that I didn't do two separate videos for them. I am most likely going to do South Asians next. I might just bounce back and forth between African and Asian regions for the rest of this series. I don't know, it's just kind of fun that way. But yeah, I'm having fun going through this, and I'm definitely looking forward to doing more. Thank you all for supporting, and I'll be back with more content soon. Take care.